The assembly hall smelled of pine resin and something darker, sweat mixed with anticipation. The kind that clung to skin when too many bodies pressed together in a space meant for judgment. I stood at the back, my hand resting unconsciously on the swell of my belly, feeling the rhythmic kicks that had become my only constant companion these past months. The wooden beams above groaned under the weight of autumn rain, each drop against the roof a small percussion that matched my racing heartbeat. 7 months. 7 months since the mating ceremony that should have changed everything. 7 months since I'd felt the bond snap into place like a key turning in a lock I hadn't known existed. 7 months since King Dashel Northwood had looked through me as though I were made of glass. Or worse, as though I weren't there at all. The crowd shifted, and I caught a glimpse of him at the front of the hall. Even from this distance, his presence dominated the space. Tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell just past his collar and eyes the color of winter storms. He sat on the raised platform reserved for the highest-ranking members of our pack, his posture relaxed in a way that suggested complete control. Next to him, Lady Seraphine laughed at something he'd said, her hand resting possessively on his forearm. Her red dress was cut low, expensive. Everything I wasn't. I looked down at my simple cotton dress, let out at the seams to accommodate my growing belly. My blonde hair, once my mother's pride, hung limply around my shoulders. I hadn't had the energy to braid it this morning. I hadn't had the energy for much of anything lately. Move aside, Omega. The voice was sharp, dismissive. I stepped back automatically as Beta Corwin pushed past me, his shoulder knocking against mine hard enough that I stumbled. He didn't look back. No one ever did. I'd been born Omega in a world that worshipped strength. My wolf was small, pale as moonlight, her voice a whisper where others roared. Even before the mating bond, I'd learned to make myself invisible, to move through spaces without disturbing the air. My mother had taught me that survival sometimes meant becoming a shadow. She died when I was 15, her wolf too weak to fight off the fever that took her. My father followed 6 months later, his heart simply giving up. The pack provided for me because law demanded it, but charity carried its own weight, its own shame. Then came the selection. Every unmated wolf in our territory gathered for the ceremony, the ancient ritual where the Alpha King would find his queen. I'd gone because refusing meant exile. But I hadn't expected the golden thread that shot from my chest to his the moment he'd entered the ceremonial circle. I'd felt it wrap around my ribs, warm and inevitable. I'd seen his eyes widen just for a second before his expression closed like a door slamming shut. "The bond is acknowledged," he'd said, his voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Let the witnesses record it," that was all. No declaration of affection, no claim of devotion, just cold acknowledgement of a biological fact he couldn't ignore. The ceremony concluded, I was moved to a small room in the eastern wing of the palace, far from his chambers, far from anywhere that mattered. A healer confirmed my pregnancy 3 weeks later. I'd sent word through the proper channels. He'd never responded. Now, as Elder Magda called the assembly to order, I felt the pup shift inside me, a rolling movement that pressed against my bladder. I needed to sit down, but all the benches were full, claimed by wolves whose rank gave them the right to comfort. So I stood, swaying slightly, trying to focus on the elder's words. "We gather in troubled times," Magda announced, her voice carrying the rasp of her 90 years. "The western borders have seen increased rogue activity, 3 patrols attacked in as many weeks. We must strengthen our defenses, increase our numbers." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Fear smelled different than anticipation. Sharper, more metallic. I pressed harder against my belly, as if I could shield the life inside from the worry saturating the air. "His Majesty will address the strategy," Magda continued, stepping aside. Dashel rose with fluid grace. When he spoke, every wolf in the hall fell silent. "The rogues grow bold because they sense weakness. We've been too lenient, too scattered. Starting tomorrow, all warriors will undergo additional training. Patrols double. Anyone who cannot contribute to our defense will be relocated to the interior settlements until the threat passes." My blood went cold. Relocated. That meant sent away, stripped of what little place I had here. And I, pregnant, Omega, bonded to a king who wouldn't look at me. I had nothing to contribute, Nothing but the child growing inside me, and even that felt like something he'd rather forget. "Your Majesty." Beta Corwin stood, his voice carrying false deference. "What of those already burdening our resources, the weak who consume but cannot fight?" Several heads turned toward the back of the hall, toward me. My cheeks burned, but I kept my expression neutral. Years of invisibility had taught me how to hide. Dashiell's gaze swept the room, passing over me without pause. "Resources will be allocated based on strategic value. Those who cannot serve will make room for those who can." The dismissal in his tone was absolute. I felt something crack inside my chest. Not the bond. That remained intact, a constant ache I couldn't escape, but something smaller. Hope, maybe. The foolish kind that had whispered he might care once the baby came, once he held his child. The assembly continued, discussions of border fortifications and supply chains, but I stopped listening. The pup kicked again, harder this time, and I bit my lip against the sudden pressure low in my spine. Not now. Not here. I just needed to get back to my room, to the small space where I could breathe without everyone's eyes judging my existence. I turned to leave as quietly as I'd arrived, but the movement sent a sharp pain through my side. I gasped, one hand flying to the wall for support. An elderly woman near the door glanced at me, her expression softening for just a moment. "You all right, child?" she whispered. "Fine," I managed, "just tired." She nodded, but her eyes held something that looked like pity. I hated pity more than I hated contempt. At least contempt acknowledged I was strong enough to bear their judgment. Pity suggested I was already broken. I made it into the corridor before the next pain hit. This one doubled me over, stealing my breath. Too early. The baby wasn't due for another 6 weeks. But my body didn't care about timelines. Didn't care that I was alone in a marble hallway with no one who would hear me call for help. The pain subsided slowly, leaving me shaking. False labor, maybe. The healer had warned me it could happen. I just needed to rest, to breathe, to make it back to my room. I straightened carefully, testing my weight on trembling legs. That's when I caught his scent. Pine and smoke and something wild that made my wolf stir despite everything. I looked up. Dashiell stood at the end of the corridor, alone. He must have left through the side entrance while I was trying not to collapse. For a moment, we simply stared at each other across the distance. The bond pulled tight between us, a living thing that begged me to go to him, to seek the comfort and protection that should have been mine by right. His expression was unreadable, those storm-gray eyes fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin prickle. I waited for him to turn away, to dismiss me as he'd done every time our paths had crossed these past months. My hand remained pressed to my belly, protective, defiant, in the only way I knew how to be, but he didn't turn away. Instead, he took a step forward, then another. His nostrils flared slightly as he scented the air. Could he smell my distress? The bond would tell him something was wrong, even if he'd spent months ignoring every other signal it sent. "You should be resting." His voice was rough, unused to addressing me directly. The absurdity of it struck me like a slap. 7 months of silence, and his first words to me were a command disguised as concern. Something hot and reckless rose in my throat. "I was at the assembly," I said quietly, "where you made it clear that those who can't fight don't belong here." His jaw tightened. "That wasn't personal," I supplied. Another pain rippled through me, but I locked my knees, refusing to show weakness. Not now. Not to him. "No, of course not. Nothing has been personal, has it, Your Majesty?" The title tasted bitter. He'd never asked me to use it, but then, he'd never asked me to use his name either. We were strangers bound by biology and tradition, and the child between us was just another complication he hadn't wanted. For a long moment, he simply looked at me. Something flickered behind his eyes. Recognition, maybe, or regret. But it vanished before I could name it. "You shouldn't strain yourself," he finally said. Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the marble corridor until they faded into silence. I stood there long after he'd gone, one hand on my belly and the other pressed against the cold wall. The pup moved again, a flutter that felt almost like a question. "What do we do now?" I didn't have an answer. I'd survived my parents' deaths, survived being Omega in a pack that valued only strength, survived 7 months of being invisible to the one person who should have seen me most clearly. I would survive this too. I had to. Because my child deserved better than a mother who gave up. I pushed off from the wall and made my way slowly back to my room. Each step a small victory against the exhaustion that weighed on my bones. Tomorrow, I would figure out how to stay, how to prove I had value beyond fighting. Tonight, I would rest and feel my baby move and remember that I wasn't entirely alone. The bond still hummed between us, that infuriating connection I couldn't sever no matter how much his indifference hurt. It whispered that he'd felt something when he saw me in pain, that the step forward had been instinctive, protective, before his mind caught up and reminded him why he kept his distance. But instinct and intention were different things. And I'd learned long ago that hoping for more than survival was a luxury Omegas couldn't afford. Still, as I finally reached my door and stepped into the quiet sanctuary of my small room, I allowed myself one rebellious thought. When this child was born, when he held his son or daughter in his arms, surely even a king who'd turned his heart to stone would have to feel something. Surely even he couldn't ignore that. The pains came again 3 days later, stronger this time, tearing through me in waves that left me gasping against the thin mattress. Dawn light filtered through the single window of my room, painting everything in shades of gray and pale gold. I'd been awake most of the night, tracking the intervals between contractions, trying to convince myself it was still too early, that my body was simply preparing, not surrendering. But when the wetness soaked through my nightgown and pooled beneath me, I knew I was out of time. My hands shook as I reached for the bell pull. A concession to my condition that had appeared in my room 2 months ago without explanation. I yanked it once, twice, then collapsed back against the pillows as another contraction seized me. The pain was different now, purposeful, demanding. My body had made its decision regardless of calendars or my silent prayers for more time. The healer arrived within minutes, her weathered face creasing with concern as she took in the scene. "How long?" she asked, already moving to examine me. "Since midnight, but stronger in the last hour." My voice came out thin, reedy. I hated how weak I sounded. Her hands were gentle but efficient as she checked me, and I saw her expression tighten. "The babe is coming, child. Early, but coming nonetheless. I'll need to send for assistance." "Don't!" I gasped as another wave hit. "Don't tell him. Please." She paused, her dark eyes meeting mine with something like understanding. "He's the Alpha King. He has a right to know his child is being born. He hasn't wanted to know anything for 7 months. The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. "Don't make him come out of obligation. I can do this alone." I'd been doing everything alone. What was one more impossible thing? But the healer shook her head firmly. "This isn't about want, girl. It's about law and bond. He'll know something's wrong the moment the birthing truly begins. The bond will tell him. Better he hears it from me than feels it rip through him during a council meeting." She left before I could argue further, and I was alone with the pain and the fear that had been my companions for months. The contractions came closer together now, each one a reminder that my body was doing something it wasn't quite ready for. 6 weeks early, the baby would be small, maybe too small, and I was Omega, my wolf weak, my human form not much stronger. The statistics whispered through my mind, the ones I'd overheard healers discussing when they thought I wasn't listening. Omega mothers had higher risks. Early births compounded them, and complications. Complications could mean I wouldn't survive to see my child grow. I pushed the thought away viciously. I'd survived this long on nothing but stubbornness and the fierce determination to prove everyone wrong. I wouldn't give up now, wouldn't let this baby come into the world motherless the way I'd been left. The door opened again, and 2 younger healers entered with the elder, their arms full of linens and supplies. They moved around me with practiced efficiency, transforming my small room into something resembling a birthing chamber. One of them, a kind-faced woman named Helena, offered me water and murmured encouragements that I barely heard over the roaring in my ears. "Where is he?" I asked when I could speak again. Not because I wanted him there, I told myself. just because I needed to know if I'd have to endure his cold presence through this too. The elder healer's expression was carefully neutral. Beta Corwin delivered the message. His Majesty was informed. That wasn't an answer, and we both knew it. Informed didn't mean coming, didn't mean caring. It just meant one more obligation noted and filed away in whatever corner of his mind he reserved for things he'd rather forget. The hours blurred together after that. Pain became my entire world, a red tide that ebbed and flowed, but never fully retreated. I lost track of time, of the encouragements the healers murmured, of everything except the primal need to push, to bring this child into the world no matter what it cost me. Somewhere in the haze, I heard raised voices outside my door. The elder healer left, and when she returned, her face was troubled. "What?" I managed between pants. "What's wrong?" "Nothing, child. Just, the king wishes to be informed of progress. But he's not coming." It wasn't a question. Her silence was answer enough. Something hardened in my chest then. Something that felt like the final death of that foolish hope I'd cradled. He would wait outside, would hear the reports, would acknowledge the existence of his child the same way he'd acknowledged our bond, as a fact to be recorded, nothing more. Fine. I didn't need him. I'd never needed him. "The baby's crowning," Helena said urgently. "One more push, sweetheart. One more and you'll meet your little one." I gathered every scrap of strength I had left and bore down, feeling my body tear, feeling something fundamental shift inside me. The pain crested impossibly high. And then, a cry, thin and reedy but unmistakably alive. "A girl," the elder healer announced, and I heard the smile in her voice. "You have a daughter." They placed her on my chest moments later. This tiny creature with a shock of pale blonde hair and eyes that hadn't quite decided their color. She was so small, her fingers like twigs, her cry weak but persistent. My daughter. Mine. "Hello?" I whispered, and she turned toward my voice. The bond I felt then was different from the one that tied me to Dashiell. This was pure, uncomplicated, absolute. I would burn the world down for this child. I would tear apart anyone who threatened her. The fierceness of it shocked me. "What will you name her?" Helena asked softly. I hadn't let myself think about names, hadn't wanted to tempt fate. But looking at her now, one name rose above all others. "Sage," I said. "For wisdom and strength she'll need." The healer smiled, but the elder's expression remained troubled. She was examining me with hands that pressed too hard, searched too urgently. "What is it?" I asked, though part of me already knew. The exhaustion pulling at me felt too heavy, too dark, and there was warmth spreading beneath me. Too much warmth. "You're bleeding," she said quietly. "Too much. Helena, bring the cauterizing supplies and send word to His Majesty, now." The urgency in her tone sent ice through my veins. I looked down at Sage, memorizing every detail of her small face. If this was all the time I had, I wanted to remember, wanted her to somehow know, even if she was too young to retain the memory, that her mother had loved her absolutely from the first breath. "I need to take her," Helena said gently, reaching for the baby. "No." My arms tightened instinctively. "Please, just a little longer. We need to work, child, and you need to conserve your strength." The elder's voice was kind but firm. "She'll be right here. You'll see her again." The promise felt empty, but I didn't have the strength to fight. I let Helena lift Sage from my arms, watched through blurring vision as my daughter was wrapped in soft blankets and placed in a basket near the window. She was still crying, that thin, persistent wail that spoke of life and need, and a future I desperately wanted to be part of. The healers worked over me with increasing urgency. I felt their hands, heard their murmured consultations, but it all seemed distant now, as though I were sinking beneath water. The pain had transformed into something else, a cold numbness that spread from my core outward. "Stay with us," the elder commanded. "Look at me, girl. Stay present." I tried. I focused on Sage's cries, on the sound of rain that had started against the window, on anything that could anchor me to this world. But the darkness was so heavy, and I was so tired. The door crashed open. Through my fading vision, I saw him. Dashiell, his face pale and expression shattered in a way I'd never seen. He crossed the room in 3 strides, his presence filling the space, and for the first time since our bonding, I felt the full force of the connection between us. It wasn't cold or distant now. It burned. No. The word was raw, almost inhuman. No, you don't leave. Do you hear me? You don't get to leave. His hands gripped mine, and I felt power flood through the bond, his strength trying to shore up my failing body, his wolf howling mine awake. It hurt, that much life slamming into me when I'd been sliding toward peace. The baby, I whispered. Sage, you have to... promise me. You'll tell me yourself. His voice shook. You'll hold her and tell her stories and watch her grow. You don't give up. Omegas are survivors. You told me that once, do you remember? My mother told me. You survive. I didn't remember telling him anything. We'd barely spoken. But his eyes were desperate, no longer stone but molten, and the bond sang between us with an intensity that felt like coming home and being torn apart simultaneously. I'm trying, I managed. And I was. For Sage. For the life I wanted to live. For this impossible man who'd ignored me for months, but now looked at me like I was the only thing keeping his world from shattering. The elder healer shouted something about more pressure, about preparations. Other wolves entered. I smelled them more than saw them. Felt the energy shift as powerful wolves lent their strength to the healer's efforts. Pack magic. Old and primal. Woven into medicine and will. Through it all, Dashiell held my hand. He murmured things I couldn't quite hear. Promises or prayers or curses. His thumb traced circles on my wrist, right over my racing pulse. As if he could keep my heart beating through sheer determination. Time became strange again. Minutes or hours, I couldn't tell. But slowly, impossibly, the darkness receded. The cold numbness transformed back into manageable pain, into exhaustion that felt survivable rather than final. The bleeding stopped, the elder finally announced, and the relief in her voice was palpable. She's stabilized. Weak, but stable. I drew in a shaking breath, then another. Sage's cries had quieted to small whimpers. Someone must have fed her, comforted her while I'd been fighting to stay alive. The thought of missing even that small moment made my chest ache. I want to see her, I said, my voice barely audible. Soon, the elder promised. Let us finish here. Make sure everything's as it should be. But I was looking at Dashiell, at this man who'd been a stranger wearing the title of mate. His face was still pale, his eyes red-rimmed. Had he been crying? Kings didn't cry, I'd thought. Alphas didn't break. But the man holding my hand looked shattered. You came, I whispered. His jaw worked, and when he spoke, his voice was rough. I should have come sooner. Should have been here from the beginning. It wasn't an apology, not exactly. But it was acknowledgement, and that was more than I'd had in 7 months. I didn't have the energy to be angry or bitter or anything but grateful that we'd all survived this night. The healers finished their work, and finally, blessedly, brought Sage back to me. She'd stopped crying, her eyes closed in milk-drunk sleep, one tiny fist curled against her cheek. Perfect. Impossible. Mine. Ours, Dashiell corrected. And I realized I'd spoken aloud. I looked up at him. This king who ruled thousands but couldn't seem to take his eyes off the tiny child in my arms. Ours, I echoed, testing the word. He reached out tentatively, and I shifted so he could see her better. His finger traced her cheek with a gentleness I didn't know he possessed, and I watched his expression transform. Wonder, fear, fierce protectiveness, all cycling across features I'd thought were carved from marble. Sage, I told him. I named her Sage. It's perfect. His voice cracked on the words, then softer. I'm sorry. For everything. For being a coward when you needed me to be strong. The apology hung between us, fragile and new. I didn't know if I could forgive him yet. Didn't know if this moment would last, or if he'd retreat back into cold distance once the crisis passed. But looking at him holding our daughter's tiny hand, I thought maybe, there was a chance for something more than survival. Maybe there was a chance for something like hope. The weeks following Sage's birth blurred into a haze of sleepless nights and quiet moments that felt stolen from a life I'd never imagined living. My small room in the eastern wing transformed overnight, not through my doing, but through orders I never heard given. A larger bed appeared, its frame carved from dark wood that smelled of cedar. A rocking chair materialized near the window, cushioned in soft fabric perfect for cradling a restless infant. Supplies arrived daily, blankets woven from the finest wool, clothes small enough for Sage's tiny frame, herbs to help my body heal from the trauma of her birth. And Dashiell came. Not constantly, not with any declaration or fanfare. But he appeared each evening as the sun set, standing in my doorway as though asking permission to enter a space that technically belonged to him by right of kingship. The first few times I'd simply stared, too exhausted to form words, unsure what to do with this version of him. Uncertain, almost tentative. So different from the cold authority he wore in public. "May I?" He'd asked that first evening, gesturing toward Sage sleeping in her basket. I'd nodded, watching as he crossed the room with careful steps, as though the floorboards might shatter beneath him. He'd stood over her for long minutes, just watching the rise and fall of her small chest, before leaving without another word. Now, 3 weeks later, he held her while I attempted to eat the dinner that had been brought to my room. My hands still shook sometimes, my body not yet fully recovered from how close I'd come to slipping away. The healers visited daily, monitoring my progress with careful attention that felt both comforting and suffocating. "She has your eyes," Dashiell said quietly, his large hands cradling Sage with a gentleness that made something in my chest constrict. I thought they might change, but they're staying that blue-gray, like storm clouds. I paused, the spoon halfway to my mouth. We'd existed in careful silence mostly, speaking only about Sage's needs, when she'd last fed, whether she'd slept, small observations that felt safe. This was different. Personal. "My mother's eyes," I said softly. She used to say they were the color of the sea before a storm, warning and promise all at once. He looked up at me then, really looked, and I saw something shift in his expression. "You never speak of them, your parents." "There isn't much to say." I set down the spoon, my appetite fading. "They were good people who died too young. My mother was Omega like me. My father was a warrior, mid-rank. Strong enough to protect us, not strong enough to save himself when grief took him." The room fell quiet except for Sage's small sounds, those indefinable noises infants make between sleep and waking. Dashiell's thumb traced gentle circles on her back, a soothing rhythm I'd watched him develop over these past weeks. "My mother was Omega too," he finally said, his voice rough with something that might have been old pain. "Strongest woman I ever knew. She ruled beside my father not through dominance but through wisdom. When she died, something in him broke. He became harder, colder, started preaching that Omegas were weak, that their gentleness was a liability in a world that demanded strength. I stared at him, pieces clicking into place. "That's why you pushed you away," he finished, his jaw tight. When the bond snapped to an Omega, all I could see was my father's warning. All I could hear was his voice telling me that loving someone gentle meant inviting devastation. So I convinced myself distance was protection for both of us. The confession hung between us, raw and painful. Part of me wanted to rage at him, to throw his cowardice back in his face. But I'd spent too many nights holding Sage and feeling the weight of impossible choices, understanding how fear could make people cruel even when they meant to be kind. "Your father was wrong," I said quietly. "Omega doesn't mean weak. It means we survive differently. We bend instead of breaking. We find strength in places dominance would never think to look." His eyes met mine, and for a moment the bond hummed between us, warm and questioning. "I know that now. Watching you nearly die bringing our daughter into the world, then wake up and immediately ask to hold her." His voice cracked. "You're the strongest person I've ever known. And I was too much of a coward to see it." Sage chose that moment to wake fully, her small face scrunching before she released a cry that seemed impossibly loud for such a tiny creature. Dashiell looked momentarily panicked, and despite everything, I felt my lips curve into a small smile. "She's hungry," I said, reaching for her, And she won't take no for an answer. Strong lungs on this one. He handed her over carefully, and I positioned her to nurse, that small tug and pull that had become as natural as breathing. Dashiell looked away, giving me privacy, and I appreciated the gesture, even as part of me noticed how different this was from 3 weeks ago, when he could barely stand to be in the same room. "The council is asking questions," he said after a moment, his gaze fixed on the window where darkness had fully fallen. "About you. About Sage. About why the Alpha King's mate is hidden away in the eastern wing instead of presented as queen." My stomach clenched. I'd known this was coming. Known that the fragile bubble of these past weeks couldn't last. "What did you tell them?" "That you're recovering. That the birth was difficult, and you need time." He turned back to face me. "But they're not wrong to question it. You should be in the royal chambers. Sage should be celebrated, not kept secret like something to be ashamed of. Are you ashamed?" The question escaped before I could stop it. "No." The answer was immediate, fierce. "Never. But I understand why you'd think so. Why everyone would." He moved closer, kneeling beside the chair so we were eye level. "I want to change that, if you'll let me. If you can forgive me enough to try." Sage had finished nursing and was dozing against my chest, milk-drunk and content. I looked down at her, at this perfect creature who deserved better than parents who existed in separate worlds, who'd given her life but couldn't figure out how to build one together. "I don't know if I can forget," I said honestly. 7 months of silence. 7 months of feeling like I didn't matter. That's not something that disappears because you held my hand while I was dying. "I know." His hand rested on the arm of the chair, inches from mine, but not touching. "I'm not asking you to forget. I'm asking for a chance to prove I can be the mate you deserved from the beginning. The father Sage deserves." Before I could respond, a sharp knock interrupted us. Dashiell stood, his entire demeanor shifting from vulnerable to authoritative in the space of a heartbeat. "Enter." Beta Corwin stepped in, his expression carefully neutral as he took in the domestic scene. "Your Majesty, forgive the intrusion, but there's been an incident at the western border. The rogues have attacked another patrol, 3 injured, 1 dead." I felt Dashiell tense, saw the king replace the man who'd been kneeling beside me. "How bad?" "Bad enough that the border packs are demanding stronger presence. They're questioning whether our current strategy is adequate." Corwin's eyes flickered to me briefly, dismissively. "The council is convening within the hour." Dashiell nodded curtly. "I'll be there." He looked back at me, conflict clear in his expression. "I have to." "I know. Go." I adjusted Sage in my arms, using her weight as both comfort and shield. "We'll be fine." He hesitated, and I saw him warring with himself. Duty and desire, kingship and something more personal. Finally, he reached out and brushed his fingers across Sage's soft hair, then did something that shocked me. His hand moved to cup my cheek, thumb tracing my cheekbone with the same gentleness he'd shown our daughter. "I'll return as soon as I can," he said softly. Then he was gone, following Corwin out, and I was alone again, with the silence and the weight of everything unsaid. I stood carefully, my body still protesting certain movements, and carried Sage to the window. The palace grounds stretched below, torches marking pathways through darkness. Somewhere out there, wolves were dying. Families were losing sons and daughters, mates and siblings. And here I sat, warm and safe and utterly useless. The thought gnawed at me. I'd survived birth, survived bleeding out, survived 7 months of invisibility. But I hadn't proven I could contribute anything beyond producing an heir. The council's questions weren't just about protocol. They were about value. What good was an Omega Queen who couldn't fight, couldn't strategize, couldn't do anything but exist as a living reminder of biological imperative? Sage stirred against me, and I looked down at her perfect face. She deserved a mother who was more than just a survivor. She deserved a mother who could stand beside her father as an equal, who could show her that strength came in many forms. I thought of my own mother, who'd died young but lived fiercely, who'd taught me that Omegas had gifts that dominance-focused wolves couldn't comprehend: empathy, intuition, the ability to read emotional currents others missed. She'd called it our secret weapon, the thing that kept packs stable when alpha pride would tear them apart. Maybe it was time I stopped hiding that weapon away. The next morning, I asked Helena to help me dress in something other than the simple gowns I'd been wearing. Something appropriate for court, I specified, watching her eyes widen. Are you certain? You're barely healed. I'm certain. I'd spent the night thinking, planning, working through the fear that had kept me small, and I need you to send a message to His Majesty. Tell him I request an audience with the council. Helena looked like she wanted to argue, but something in my expression must have convinced her. She nodded slowly. I'll send word, but please, don't push yourself too hard. You gave us all quite a scare. Sage was fed and sleeping soundly when I made my way through the palace halls hours later, my steps slow but steady. I'd left her with Helena, who'd agreed to watch her despite her protests about my sanity. The dress I wore was simple but well made, in deep forest green that brought out the color of my eyes. My blonde hair was braided and pinned, every inch of me carefully composed. I would not go before the council as a victim or a burden. I would go as a queen, even if I didn't feel like one yet. The council chamber was exactly as I'd imagined. Massive, imposing, filled with wolves whose power rolled off them in waves. Long tables formed a rectangle, and Dashiell sat at the head, flanked by his highest-ranking advisors. Every head turned when I entered, conversations dying mid-sentence. I felt their judgment like a physical weight. Saw the dismissal in some eyes, curiosity in others, outright hostility in a few. Beta Corwin's lip curled slightly before he schooled his expression to neutrality. Dashiell stood, surprise clear on his face. I didn't expect... I know. I moved forward, keeping my chin high despite the way my legs trembled. But I have something to say, to all of you. The council is in the middle of strategic planning. Corwin interjected smoothly. Matters of war aren't suitable for... For what? I turned to face him directly. For an Omega? For the Alpha King's mate? Or just for someone you've decided has nothing valuable to contribute? Silence fell like a blade. Several council members shifted uncomfortably. Dashiell's expression was unreadable, but he gestured for me to continue. I took a breath, reaching for the strength my mother had promised lived inside me. You're right that I can't fight. I can't lead patrols or devise military strategy, but I can do something none of you seem to be doing. I can ask why rogues who've been content at the borders for generations are suddenly attacking organized patrols. They're animals, one elder growled. They don't need reasons beyond violence. Everyone needs reasons. I moved closer to the table, placing my hands on its surface. Rogues become rogues because they've been exiled or fled or lost their packs. They survive in the margins because they have to, not because they want to. So what changed? What's driving them from survival to aggression? The question hung in the air. I saw several council members exchange glances. Saw the shift from dismissal to consideration in their eyes. What are you suggesting? Dashiell asked quietly, his gaze intense. I'm suggesting that before we escalate to war, someone should try asking them, find out what they're running from or toward. Because if we're just treating symptoms instead of disease, we'll be fighting this battle forever. The council erupted into argument the moment I finished speaking. Voices overlapped, some dismissive, others thoughtful, a few outright hostile. I stood my ground, hands still pressed to the table, feeling the weight of every eye that bothered to look at me at all. Negotiate with rogues? Beta Corwin's voice cut through the chaos. With all respect to Her Majesty. The title dripped with sarcasm. These aren't reasonable wolves. They're feral, broken. You might as well try reasoning with rabid dogs. Then why do they attack in coordinated groups? I countered, keeping my voice steady despite the way my heart hammered. Rabid dogs don't strategize. They don't choose specific patrol routes or retreat when reinforcements arrive. Someone is leading them. Someone with enough intelligence to plan. The girl has a point. Elder Magda's voice, raspy but carrying authority, silenced several muttered objections. We've been treating this as random violence, but the pattern suggests otherwise. Perhaps it's worth investigating before we commit to full-scale conflict. And who exactly do you propose we send to chat with murderous rogues? Another council member, a scarred warrior named Tobias, leaned forward. Anyone we dispatch could be torn apart before they speak a word. The room fell silent as the weight of that truth settled. I felt my moment of confidence wavering, felt the familiar urge to shrink back, to return to invisibility. But then I thought of Sage, sleeping peacefully while we debated her future, thought of the kind of world I wanted her to grow up in. One where problems were solved through understanding when possible, violence only as last resort. "Send me," I said quietly. The silence that followed was absolute. Then Dashiell's voice, cold and flat. "No." I turned to face him, saw the storm in his eyes. "I'm Omega. I'm not a threat. And I have the authority of being your mate. They'd have to at least listen before deciding whether to attack." "Absolutely not." He stood, power radiating from him in waves that made several wolves lower their eyes instinctively. "You just barely survived childbirth 3 weeks ago. You're still healing. And you want to walk into a rogue camp alone? Not alone. With guards, with witnesses. But someone they won't immediately see as an attack." I moved closer to him, aware of everyone watching this public disagreement between king and mate. "You're all warriors. You think in terms of dominance and submission. But I see what you can't, that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is show you're not interested in dominating at all. She could be useful." The voice came from an unexpected source. Lady Seraphine, the elegant wolf who'd spent months at Dashiell's side while I'd been invisible. She watched me with calculating eyes. An Omega approaching under flag of truce carries different weight than a warrior. It shows we're willing to talk, not just posture. I didn't trust her motives, couldn't imagine she was pleased about my sudden appearance in Dashiell's life. But I'd take allies where I found them. "It's too dangerous," Dashiell repeated. But I heard the shift in his tone. He was considering it, even as everything in him rebelled against the idea. "Everything is dangerous." I held his gaze, let him see my determination. "Staying silent while your pack thinks I'm useless is dangerous. Raising our daughter in a world at war because we couldn't be bothered to ask questions is dangerous. Let me do this. Let me prove I'm more than just a vessel for your heir." The words came out harsher than I'd intended, revealing the wound that still ached beneath the fragile peace we'd built. His expression flickered, pain, guilt, recognition, before settling into resignation. "If I allow this, and I haven't decided yet, you won't go anywhere near their camp. Neutral ground, heavy guard. At the first sign of threat, you retreat." His voice carried command, but also fear poorly disguised. "And I'm coming with you. That defeats the purpose. Those are my terms." His alpha authority filled the words, brooking no argument. "You want to do this? We do it together. The king and his mate, united. That sends a message too." I wanted to argue that his presence would be seen as a show of force, but looking at him, I understood this was as much compromise as I'd get. And maybe he was right. Maybe showing that we stood together carried its own power. "Fine," I agreed. Together, the council debated for another hour, setting terms and conditions and backup plans. By the time I left the chamber, exhaustion pulled at my bones, reminding me that my body wasn't as recovered as my will pretended, but I'd done it. I'd spoken up, contributed something beyond my bloodline, earned at least some measure of respect in eyes that had seen me as nothing. Dashiell caught up with me in the corridor, his hand gentle on my elbow. That was either incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. "Can't it be both?" I tried for lightness, but my voice shook with fatigue. His expression softened, and he slipped an arm around my waist, supporting weight I hadn't realized I was barely holding. "You need to rest. The meeting with the rogues won't happen for days. We need to send messengers, establish protocols. You have time to recover." "I'm fine." "You're trembling." His voice was quiet, meant only for me. "And you've gone pale. Please. Let me help you back to your room." I wanted to protest, to maintain the strength I'd shown in the council chamber, but my body betrayed me with a stumble, and suddenly his arms were around me, lifting me as though I weighed nothing. "I can walk," I protested weakly. "I know. Humor me anyway." So I let him carry me through corridors I was still learning, past wolves who stared at the unprecedented sight of their king cradling his Omega mate, let myself rest my head against his shoulder, and breathe in that pine and smoke scent that the bond insisted meant safety, even when my mind still held reservations. He laid me carefully on the bed, then surprised me by sitting on its edge rather than leaving. "You were magnificent in there," he said softly. "The way you commanded their attention made them think beyond the obvious. That's exactly what my mother used to do. She could walk into a room full of posturing alphas, and within minutes have them questioning assumptions they'd held for decades." I was terrified, I admitted. Still am. What if I'm wrong? What if the rogues are exactly what Corwin thinks, and I end up getting people hurt trying to prove otherwise? Then we'll deal with it. His hand found mine, fingers interlacing. "But you're not wrong. I've been reviewing the patrol reports since the meeting. The attacks follow a pattern. They're targeting supply routes, not population centers. That's not mindless violence. That's strategic desperation." The observation surprised me. "You believe me. I should have believed you from the beginning." He lifted my hand, pressed his lips to my knuckles in a gesture that felt ancient and new simultaneously. "Should have trusted that the bond chose you for reasons beyond biology. That maybe an Omega was exactly what this kingdom needed to balance all our aggressive posturing." A small sound from the basket near the window interrupted us. Sage, waking from her nap with the outraged cry that meant she was hungry and wouldn't tolerate delays. Dashiell moved to get her before I could rise, lifting her with the careful confidence he'd developed over these past weeks. "I think she has opinions about our conversation timing," he said dryly, bringing her to me. I settled her to nurse, and Dashiell sat beside us, watching with an expression that made my chest ache. This felt dangerously like the family I'd stopped letting myself dream about, like something real and possible, rather than the cold obligation I'd resigned myself to. "What happens after?" I asked quietly. "After we meet with the rogues, after we resolve this crisis, what happens to us?" He was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting on Sage's back as she nursed. "I want to give you a proper mating ceremony, one where I'm not a coward, where I claim you in front of the entire kingdom as my chosen queen, where everyone knows that you're not here by accident or obligation, but because you're exactly who I need beside me." The words should have filled me with joy, but instead, I felt only wariness. "Pretty words are easy, Dashiell. It's the follow-through that matters." "I know." He met my eyes, and I saw the raw honesty there. "I know I have to earn your trust, that showing up and being present for a few weeks doesn't erase 7 months of absence. But I'm asking for the chance, not because of the bond or duty or even Sage, though she's the best thing I've ever been part of creating, but because I want to know you. The woman who stood before my council and made seasoned warriors reconsider their assumptions. The mother who nearly died rather than give up. The Omega who's stronger than any alpha I've ever met." Sage finished nursing and made her small, satisfied sounds, milk-drunk and drowsy. I adjusted her against my shoulder, patting her back gently, using the motion to buy myself time to process everything he'd said. "I need to see it," I finally said. "Not promises of what you'll do, but proof through action. Show me that this isn't just crisis-driven attention that'll fade once things settle." "Fair." He stood, but not before pressing a kiss to Sage's downy hair, then, hesitantly, to my forehead. "Get some rest, both of you. I'll have dinner sent up, and I'll be back this evening if you'll have me." "Dashiell." I stopped him at the door. "Thank you. For listening in the council. For not dismissing me outright." His smile was crooked, touched with self-deprecation. "Thank you for not letting me. For being brave enough to speak up even when everyone in that room has given you reason to stay silent." After he left, I held Sage close and let myself feel the complicated tangle of emotions I'd been suppressing. Hope, still fragile and uncertain. Fear of being hurt again. Determination to prove myself regardless of whether he kept his promises. And beneath it all, that persistent bond humming its insistence that we belonged together, that this was meant to be. The days before the rogue meeting passed in careful preparation. Dashiell visited daily, sometimes twice, his presence becoming familiar rather than jarring. He held Sage while I ate, changed her when she needed it with increasingly practiced hands, and talked to me about things beyond pack politics, his childhood, his mother's teachings, the weight of crown he'd inherited too young when his father died in border skirmishes. I found myself softening despite my determination to guard my heart. Found myself looking forward to his evening visits, to the way Sage's face lit up when she heard his voice. She was too young to truly recognize him, but some instinct knew her father, responded to his presence with coos and gestures that melted his carefully maintained composure. "She's going to be trouble," he said one evening, watching her grab at his finger with surprising strength. "Too smart for her own good if she takes after her mother. And too stubborn if she takes after her father," I countered, earning one of his rare, genuine smiles. Helena knocked softly before entering, her expression troubled. "Forgive the interruption, your majesties, but the messenger has returned from the rogue territory. They've agreed to meet, but on one condition." "What condition?" Dashiell's voice sharpened with suspicion. "They want the Omega Queen to approach first, alone, for the initial contact. They say it's the only way they'll trust this isn't an ambush." Helena's eyes flickered to me apologetically. "They've heard of you, it seems. Word travels even among rogues that the Alpha King has finally acknowledged his mate." My stomach clenched. How far alone? How long? Just long enough to establish good faith. Perhaps 50 yards from the guard line, 5 minutes of conversation, then you signal for the rest of the delegation to approach. She hesitated. "They're offering their leader's sister as collateral. She'll remain with our guards while you're exposed." "It's a show of mutual trust." "Absolutely not." Dashiell stood, power rolling off him. "The entire point of neutral ground was protection. This is—" "What I expected," I interrupted quietly. "They have every reason to distrust us. Rogues are created through exile, through packs turning their backs. Why would they believe we're negotiating in good faith without proof? Because they asked for the meeting. No, we offered it." I shifted Sage to my other shoulder, her weight grounding me. "This is reasonable, Dashiell. It's what I would demand in their position." His jaw worked, and I watched him war with himself, the protective mate versus the strategic king. Finally, "I don't like it. I know, but it's necessary." He turned away, staring out the window at darkness beyond. "If anything happens to you, then you'll have Sage to remember me by, and hopefully enough information to prevent more pointless deaths." I tried to keep my voice light, but the words rang hollow. "I'll be careful. I promise." He looked back at me, anguish clear in his expression. 3 weeks ago, I nearly lost you on a birthing bed. Forgive me for not being eager to risk you again so soon. 3 weeks ago, you barely knew me." The words came out sharper than intended. "Now you suddenly care?" The accusation hung between us, all the hurt I'd been suppressing bubbling to the surface. He crossed the room in 2 strides, kneeling before my chair the way he had weeks ago, his hands covering mine where they rested on Sage's back. "I always cared," he said roughly. "I was just too damaged and stupid to show it. My father spent years teaching me that caring was weakness, that attachment led to devastation. When the bond snapped to you, all I could think was that he'd been right, that loving an Omega would destroy me the same way losing my mother destroyed him. So I pushed you away, convinced myself distance was protection." His voice cracked. "But nearly losing you taught me that distance is just another kind of destruction. Slower, maybe, but no less devastating. I wanted to stay angry, wanted to hold on to the hurt as protection against future disappointment. But looking at him, this powerful king kneeling before me with tears in his eyes, I felt my defenses crumbling. "I'm still scared," I whispered. "Of trusting you. Of believing this is real and not just crisis-driven emotion that'll fade. Then let me prove it." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against mine carefully. "Mindful of Sage between us, let me spend the rest of our lives proving it. But please, please don't take unnecessary risks. Our daughter needs her mother. And I—" He swallowed hard. "I need you. Not because of the bond or duty, because you make me want to be better than my father's son. Because you see possibilities I'm too jaded to imagine. Because when you smile at our daughter, I see the future I want instead of the past I'm trying to escape." The confession broke something open in my chest, something I'd been keeping locked and guarded. I lifted one hand to cup his face, feeling the slight stubble on his jaw, the warmth of skin that the bond insisted belonged with mine. "Okay," I breathed. Okay. The morning of the meeting dawned cold and bright, frost clinging to grass that crunched beneath boots as we assembled at the western border. I'd left Sage with Helena, that separation tearing at something primal in my chest, even though I knew she was safe. Knew that if this went wrong, at least she'd have someone who'd care for her, love her, tell her that her mother had tried to build a better world. Dashiell hadn't left my side since we'd departed the palace, his presence both comfort and added pressure. The guard contingent was small but powerful. Beta Corwin, Lady Seraphine, Elder Magda, and a dozen warriors whose strength rolled off them in waves. We'd chosen the clearing carefully. Open ground visible from all sides, a stream running through the center that marked neutral territory by ancient custom. The rogues appeared as the sun crested the tree line. There were fewer than I'd expected, maybe 20 all told, but they moved with the careful coordination of wolves who'd learned to survive through intelligence rather than just strength. At their center walked a man who could only be their leader, tall, lean, with scars crossing his face like a map of violence survived. Beside him, a woman who shared his sharp features, the sister who'd volunteered as collateral. "This is madness," Corwin muttered beside me. "We should have brought twice the warriors." "And they would have brought twice the rogues," I replied quietly. "This was never about numbers, it's about trust." The two groups stopped 50 yards apart, exactly as agreed. My heart hammered so loudly I was certain everyone could hear it. Dashiell's hand found mine briefly, squeezed once, reassurance or farewell, I wasn't sure which. "I'll be watching," he said, low enough that only I heard. "Any sign of trouble, and I'm there." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and stepped forward. Behind me, I heard the collective intake of breath as I moved away from safety, walking across open ground toward wolves who had every reason to hate what I represented. The grass whispered against my legs, the stream's burble grew louder, and then I was standing in the neutral zone, waiting. The rogue leader's sister approached from the other side. We met in the middle, standing on opposite banks of the stream that was barely 3 feet wide. Up close, I could see she was younger than I'd first thought, maybe 25, with eyes that held old pain and deeper wariness. "I'm Rhiannon," she said, her voice rough from disuse or shouting. I couldn't tell which. "My brother is Caden. He leads what's left of us. I hesitated. What did I call myself? The queen I'd never been acknowledged as? The Omega who'd been invisible? "I'm the Alpha King's mate, mother to his daughter, and I'm here because I think we're all asking the wrong questions." Rhiannon's eyebrow rose slightly. Bold words from someone standing alone between two armies. They're not armies. They're scared people trying to survive. I gestured behind me, then toward her group. Everyone here has lost someone. Everyone here is tired. So before more die, I want to understand why you're attacking. We're not attacking. Her voice sharpened with frustration. We're defending, or trying to, but you palace wolves don't see the difference. I felt the pieces shift in my mind, the pattern becoming clear. Defending from what? She studied me for a long moment, as though measuring my sincerity. Finally, there are hunters, human hunters who've learned what we are, who've been tracking us, trapping us. They stay just beyond your borders where your patrols don't reach, picking us off one by one. We've tried running deeper into the wilderness, but they follow. Tried sending messages to your king, but rogues have no standing, no voice. So we started hitting your supply routes, trying to draw attention, force someone to investigate what's happening in the territories you've forgotten about. The confession hit me like a physical blow. Not violence for violence's sake, but desperation. A plea for help disguised as aggression because they had no other language the kingdom would hear. "How many have you lost?" I asked quietly. 17 in the last 6 months, including my mate. Her voice cracked on the last word, and I saw the grief she carried in every tense line of her body. "They use silver weapons, traps that burn. They know our weaknesses. And your king's warriors patrol right past the evidence because rogues aren't worth protecting." Behind me, I heard movement, Dashiell starting forward, his wolf probably reacting to my emotional response through the bond. I raised my hand, signaling him to wait, to let me finish. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. For your mate. For all of them. For the fact that you had to hurt people just to be heard. Rhiannon's eyes widened slightly, as though she hadn't expected empathy. Pretty words won't bring them back. No. But action might save the ones still living. I glanced back at Dashiell, saw him watching with rigid tension, then looked forward again. Let me bring him forward. Let him hear what you've told me, because this isn't about territory or dominance. It's about hunters who threaten all of us, pack and rogue alike, and that's a problem we can solve together. She hesitated, conflict clear on her face. Your king doesn't care about rogues. Why would he help us? Because I'll make him care. I spoke with more confidence than I felt. Because he's trying to be better than his father was. Because his mate is standing here asking, and he's learning that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is listen to an Omega. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. They said you were different. The rumors that reach us, that the Alpha King finally acknowledged his mate after she nearly died giving him an heir, that you're Omega, but have backbone enough to challenge council. I wasn't sure whether to believe it. Believe it. I took a breath. Signal your brother. Let Dashiell approach. If he brings more than 3 wolves with him, you can retreat, and we'll try again. But give me this chance. Give us all this chance. She studied me for another long moment, then nodded, and raised her hand in what must have been a prearranged signal. Across the clearing, Caden made a gesture of acknowledgement. I turned and beckoned Dashiell forward. He moved immediately, Corwin and Magda flanking him as agreed. They crossed the distance quickly, and suddenly he was beside me, his presence both reassuring and complicating. What's happening? He asked quietly, his eyes on Rhiannon and the rogues beyond. Listen, I said simply. Really listen. Not as a king, but as someone who understands what it means to lose everything and still keep fighting. So Rhiannon told her story again, this time to Dashiell directly. I watched his expression shift from suspicion to shock to cold fury as he understood. Not fury at the rogues, but at the hunters who'd been operating in his kingdom's shadow, at his own failure to investigate when the pattern should have been obvious. How many hunters? He asked when she finished. We've identified at least 12. Maybe more. They have a base camp in the abandoned mining territory, the area your grandfather declared cursed and forbidden after the collapse. Rhiannon's voice was steadier now, speaking to someone who might actually help. They're organized, well-funded. This isn't random violence. It's systematic extermination. Dashiell looked at Corwin. Send word immediately. I want every warrior we have mobilized. We take that camp, we capture those hunters, and we end this. Your Majesty, Corwin began, his tone suggesting objection. That's an order, Beta. Dashiell's voice carried absolute authority. These hunters are a threat to every wolf in this territory, pack and rogue alike. We defend our own, and as of now, these rogues are under my protection. The declaration hung in the air, significant beyond just the words. I saw Rhiannon's eyes fill with tears. She blinked back quickly, saw hope and disbelief war on her face. Why? She asked. Why protect rogues? Dashiell glanced at me, something warm and real in his expression. Because my mate taught me that strength isn't just about domination. It's about recognizing when you've been wrong and having the courage to change. Your people have been failed by this kingdom. That ends now. Caden approached then, crossing into neutral ground for the first time. Up close, his scars were even more pronounced, his eyes harder. What guarantees do we have that this isn't a trick, that you won't use our information and then turn on us? None except my word as Alpha King. Dashiell straightened to his full height. But I'm offering more than that. I'm offering amnesty. For any rogue who wants it, there's a place in my pack. Full membership, full protection. For those who prefer to remain independent, you have my pledge that the territories you inhabit will be considered under kingdom protection. The harassment ends. The exile ends. You'll be recognized as wolves with rights and standing. The silence that followed was profound. I saw several rogues behind Caden react with shock, hope, suspicion. This was more than they'd dared dream. offered by a king they'd thought would never see them as anything but expendable. "There will be conditions," Caden said carefully. "Integration protocols, probably. Ways for you to maintain control." "Yes," Dashiell agreed. "But they'll be negotiated fairly, with representatives from your people at the table. This isn't conquest disguised as mercy. It's a genuine offer to end the division that's weakened us all." I felt something shift in the air then, a tension breaking that I hadn't even realized we'd all been holding. Caden extended his hand, and Dashiell took it, the gesture witnessed by both groups. The beginning of something new, maybe. Or at least the end of something destructive. The negotiations that followed took hours. Elder Magda proved invaluable, her knowledge of pack law and precedent helping shape an agreement that satisfied both sides. The rogues would help locate the hunter camp, would fight alongside pack warriors to eliminate the threat. In exchange, they'd receive the protections and rights Dashiell had promised, with a trial period to ensure both sides could adapt to the new arrangement. By the time the sun began its descent, we had the framework of peace, not perfect, not without potential complications, but real and possible. "You did well," Dashiell said quietly as we walked back toward the palace, the guard contingent around us in protective formation. "What you said about asking different questions, you were right. We've been so focused on treating symptoms that we missed the disease entirely." "We did well," I corrected. "You could have dismissed everything I said, maintained your pride and position. Instead, you listened. That takes its own kind of strength." His hand found mine, fingers interlacing in a gesture that was becoming familiar. "I'm learning. Slowly, but learning." When we reached the palace, I went immediately to find Sage. Helena had her in the royal chambers, a room I'd never been invited to before, but apparently that had changed while I was gone. The space was magnificent, all dark wood and soft fabrics, with a nursery adjoining that took my breath away. "His Majesty had it prepared while you were at the border," Helena explained, seeing my expression. "Said it was past time his family lived where they belonged." I held Sage close, breathing in her milky scent, feeling her solid weight as proof that we'd all survived another day. Dashiell entered a moment later, and the sight of him in this space, our space now, apparently, made something in my chest constrict. "I should have asked first," he said, reading my expression. "Should have consulted you about moving your things here. But I wanted—" He stopped, struggling for words. "I wanted you to come home to something better than that small room. Wanted Sage to have the nursery she deserves. Wanted everyone to see that you're not hidden away in shame but honored as my queen." I looked around at the evidence of his effort. Clothes hung in the wardrobe, my few possessions carefully arranged, fresh flowers on every table. It was too much and not enough simultaneously. This grand gesture that couldn't erase months of invisibility, but spoke to genuine effort at change. "It's beautiful," I said honestly. "Overwhelming, but beautiful." He crossed to where I stood, and we simply looked at our daughter together. This tiny, perfect thing we'd created. "The council wants to hold a formal ceremony," he said after a moment. "A proper presentation of you as queen and Sage as heir. I told them I'd ask you first, that the decision was yours." I thought about it. Standing before the entire pack, being acknowledged after so long being ignored. Part of me wanted to refuse out of spite, to make him work harder for my acceptance. But looking at Sage, I understood this wasn't about my pride. It was about her future, about the world we were building for her. "Yes," I said, "but on one condition. Anything. Rhiannon and Caden are invited. The rogues who fought alongside us against the hunters, they stand with us as honored guests. I want everyone to see that this kingdom is changing, that Omega voices matter and outcasts can find home." His smile was slow and genuine. "You're going to remake this entire kingdom, aren't you?" "I'm going to try." I looked up at him. This man who'd been a stranger, an adversary, slowly becoming something more, with your help, if you're willing. "I'm willing." He leaned down, pressed his forehead to mine gently. "For you, for Sage, for the future you see that I'm only just beginning to imagine, I'm willing to change everything." The ceremony took place 3 weeks later, after the hunter camp had been eliminated and the surviving hunters brought to justice. After Caden's rogues had been integrated into the pack with surprisingly little conflict, after I'd had time to heal fully, to grow into the role I'd never expected to claim, I stood in formal dress before the assembled pack, Dashiell beside me and Sage in my arms. The council had wanted nurses to hold her, but I'd refused. She was part of this, part of the message we were sending, that vulnerability wasn't weakness, that new life was worth protecting, that a kingdom ruled with compassion could still be strong. "Before you stands my mate," Dashiell announced, his voice carrying across the great hall. The woman I was too blind to honor when the bond first chose us, who showed me that strength comes in forms I'd been taught to dismiss, who nearly died bringing our daughter into the world and woke asking only to hold her child, who walked alone toward rogues when every instinct screamed danger, because she understood that sometimes peace requires more courage than war. He turned to me, and I saw everything in his eyes: regret for lost time, hope for our future, love that had grown slowly from ashes of obligation into something real and chosen. I ask this pack to recognize her not just as my mate by bond, but as my queen by choice, as the woman who will stand beside me, whose wisdom will balance my strength, whose compassion will guide us toward justice. The pack's response was thunderous, a chorus of acceptance that washed over me in waves. Not everyone would accept me easily. I'd seen the resistance in certain eyes, the wolves who thought omegas had no place in leadership. But enough voices rose in support that the dissenters were drowned out. Elder Magda stepped forward with the crown, delicate silver woven to look like branches, studded with moonstones that caught the light. She placed it on my head with trembling hands, her smile genuine. "Rise, Queen," she said formally, "and may your reign bring the balance this kingdom has long needed." I looked out at the sea of faces. Pack wolves and former rogues standing together, old prejudices beginning to crack under the weight of new possibilities. Caught Rhiannon's eye in the crowd and saw her nod once, respect and gratitude clear in her expression. Then I looked at Dashiell, at this man who'd learned to be more than his father's son, who held our daughter with such tenderness while standing tall enough to command a kingdom. The bond between us sang with certainty now, no longer the painful ache of one-sided yearning, but the warm harmony of two wolves choosing each other daily. "Thank you," I whispered, meant only for him, for changing, for trying, for letting me be part of building something better. His hand found mine, squeezed gently. "Thank you for not giving up on me. On us. For being strong enough for both of us when I was too scared to be." Sage chose that moment to make one of her small sounds, not quite crying, not quite cooing, just the indefinable noise of an infant making her presence known. The hall erupted in laughter, the tension breaking into something lighter, more hopeful. I shifted her in my arms, and she quieted, her small hand wrapping around my finger with that surprisingly strong grip she'd inherited from her father. Looking at her, I thought of my mother, who'd told me that omegas had secret weapons, who'd promised that surviving with compassion intact was the greatest strength of all. She'd been right. I'd survived rejection, near death. Months of invisibility, had survived by bending instead of breaking, by finding strength in places dominance never thought to look. And now I stood as queen, crown on my head and child in my arms, proof that the qualities the world dismissed as weakness could reshape kingdoms. The celebration lasted long into the night. I spoke with wolves I'd never been allowed to address, heard their concerns and hopes, began building the bridges that would support the changes ahead. Dashiell never left my side, his presence steady and supportive, occasionally taking Sage when my arms grew tired, but always returning her when she fussed for me. Later, when we were finally alone in our chambers, Sage asleep in her new nursery, and the noise of celebration faded to distant murmurs, he pulled me close. "I love you," he said, the words simple but weighted with everything unspoken. "Not because of the bond or duty, because you're the bravest person I know, because you make me want to be worthy of standing beside you, because when I look at you, I see the future instead of the past." I looked up at him, at storm-gray eyes that no longer held cold distance, but warmth and vulnerability and hard-won trust. "I love you too," I admitted, the words feeling like a risk and a relief simultaneously. Not because you're perfect, you're not, but because you're trying, because you look at our daughter like she's made of starlight, because you're learning that sometimes the strongest thing a king can do is admit he was wrong. He kissed me then, gentle and thorough, the bond singing between us in pure harmony. When we finally broke apart, he rested his forehead against mine in the gesture that had become ours. "What do we do now?" he asked, echoing my question from weeks ago. I smiled, thinking of all the challenges ahead, integrating rogues, changing ancient laws, raising a daughter to be strong and kind simultaneously, building a marriage from the ruins of indifference into something real and lasting. "Now we live," I said simply. "We make mistakes and fix them. We build the kingdom our daughter deserves. We prove that omegas and alphas together are stronger than either alone. We love each other, fight with each other, grow together." "Together," he repeated, like a promise. I like the sound of that. Through the nursery door, I heard Sage make a small sound in her sleep, and we both turned toward it instinctively. Our daughter, our future, the reason we'd both been forced to become better than we'd been. The moon rose outside our window, full and bright, painting everything in silver. Somewhere in the territories, former rogues slept peacefully under kingdom protection for the first time in years. Somewhere in the palace, wolves whispered about their new queen, some skeptical, others hopeful, all of them watching to see what would happen next. I didn't know what the future held, didn't know if I'd succeed at being the queen they needed, the mother Sage deserved, the mate Dashel wanted, but I knew I'd try. Knew that survival had taught me how to bend without breaking, how to find strength in vulnerability, how to keep fighting even when the world insisted I had nothing to offer. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I was no longer invisible. I was seen, acknowledged, valued. Not despite being Omega, but because of everything that identity had taught me. The compassion, the resilience, the ability to see solutions warriors missed. I was queen. I was mother. I was mate to a king learning to rule with wisdom instead of just strength. I was exactly where I belonged, and that, more than any crown or ceremony, was the transformation I'd been seeking all along. Not to become someone else, but to finally be recognized for who I'd always been. Strong enough to survive, brave enough to love, wise enough to change a kingdom, one hard-won choice at a time. Together.